This is the slide that ended part one. I'm now going to present part two of this discussion. So what are we talking about? Quotation is where we use the exact wording of the source, word for word from the author, and we either put it in quotation marks if it is less than 4 lines of text. If it is 4 or more lines of text, we do what's called a block quotation. And you'll see this discussed in these pages in our textbook, 501 to 506. You'll also see examples in the Easy Writer handbook as well. And again, it's in part 5. Summary is what you're going to be relying on the most. And this is where you summarize an entire source in a few sentences. Sometimes you end up using a lot more than a few sentences, but as a rule, you try to keep your summary down to no more than about 20-25% the length of the original. In those summaries, you should introduce the name of the authors, if you know who they are, with what's called a signal phrase. John Smith and Fred Jones argue. That is their names, a verb. That's a minimum signal phrase. You should also include their credentials. Professors John Smith and Alan Jones argue. And that way, with the word professors, we tell who they are, and that helps us to include them or understand why they're being included into your paper. Paraphrase we use for individual sentences. This is where you take somebody else's words and you put it into your own words, sentence by sentence. Well, why would you do this? Why not just quote? Because, as I said in earlier videos, you want to establish one voice throughout the body of your paper. The more it sounds like you, the more readable it's going to be, the more the audience is going to accept what you have to say as being your take on an issue that other people have written about before, but you're presenting your particular point of view. The last thing I want to point out here is that when you quote, when you summarize, and when you paraphrase, these are all what the TRIAC model would call I, or information sentences, and they have to contain some kind of citation, an indication of the author, an indication of the source as an in-text parenthetical citation. And I'll show you some examples of that. The signal phrase I mentioned, well, what does it look like? It's the author names and their credentials plus a verb. Professors John Jones, Professor Alan Smith argue. You could say it that way, And we did this on an earlier video. I showed the Alden Wicker, and it just said he's a writer for a magazine called Ragged. Okay, that's a credential. You could, if you're quoting yourself or you're quoting a classmate, you could say student Samantha Tierney, or you could say student Amber, and that would work just as well. Okay. If you do this author name and credentials in the sentence, then you don't need to put anything but a page number at the end of that sentence to indicate the source. If it's a web sources 99.999% of the time do not have page numbers. So you don't need anything as a parenthetical or anything in parentheses at the end of that sentence. The idea that I'm trying to get across to you here is there's economical ways of doing documentation that are less trouble than you think they are, but you've got to think about your paragraph as a whole. One of the things you could argue, or you could set up in here, is your first sentence of a paragraph could say, Professors John Jones and Alan Smith argue that, blah, blah, blah. You don't need the title of their book or their article or their video, because that's all in the Works Cited page. If we have their names, we can move from the body of the paper to the Works Cited page. And then instead of documenting their name by using their names in other sentences, you could say they point out, they suggest, they assert. You could use pronouns in the rest of the section of that paragraph to indicate that those are I sentences that you summarized or paraphrased or even quoted, and that way you don't have to have a whole lot of apparatus in there that interrupts the flow of the reader. So don't forget to be able to think about using a pronoun. We'll see some examples of that here in a sec. The paraphrase. A summary is going to be a series of paraphrased sentences in all likelihood. Some of those are going to be data points, some are going to be examples, some of them are going to be discussions. But basically you're taking what somebody else has written and putting it into your own words. And I've already explained why that's important. If you do use exact words from the source, those should be in quotation marks. But there are a lot of exceptions to that quotation marks rule. If it's a proper name, it's a common word, like an article or an if there's no substitute for it or there's no synonym, then you would not put that in quotation marks. So again, look at the examples. Ask me if you have questions. It's probably going to be a little tricky at first until you get used to this, but don't underquote, but don't overquote. And that's a difficult balance to maintain. Okay. Page 507 does a really good job of showing you exactly how to write a paraphrase in our textbook. So I would check that out. Okay. As I've said a million times, one voice. That's what you're trying to establish in your paper. Remember, the first thing that people see is your name. So they assume that everything in that paper is yours unless you tell them that it isn't. So here is a paragraph. Your explaining concept paper, by the way, just to point out the thing I skipped at the last slide, is going to be mostly summary. It's going to be mostly your summary and paraphrase of what other people have said. And there's nothing wrong with that. You're trying to take something complicated and explain it to a broad audience of people who are not experts. Okay. So here we go. This is a paragraph from the essay on sexism in the textbook. It starts with a signal phrase, and you see I've underlined it here. Peter Glick and Susan Fisk wrote a paper on the concept of ambivalent sexism. Okay. Hostile sexism is what most people think of when they picture sexism. However, the authors note there is something called benevolent sexism. And then this section here is a long quotation that the writer has provided. She's indicated with these things that she's taken some sentences out. When she puts stuff in brackets here, what that indicates is that this is her wording to make a sentence quoted from the author integrate into the paragraph that she's written. Okay. So note here that it's more than 4 lines, so it's indented. Notice it has page numbers in it because she's using non-web sources, and that she's accounted for the source by giving us the names and the signal phrase up here in the top. Okay. Here she's indicated that this also comes from the same source by just saying, here, however, the author's note, and we go on from there. Okay. Here is the same section, and I've identified in here what these different sentences do. Here's the topic sentence. The topic sentence says we're talking about ambivalent sexism. Here's an information sentence. Okay. Hostile sexism is what most people think of when they picture sexism. Where did this come from? It came from Glick and Fisk. And we can infer, because this is all in the same paragraph. In this sentence, I mentioned a 1996 paper. In this paragraph, I mentioned the 2 authors, that these 2 are connected. Okay. And then I've restricted here or restated the topic and said there's this third kind of sexism called benevolent sexism. And again, this whole long quotation, that again is just what the author wrote, is all considered one big block of information. I think there's 3 sentences in here, but they're all considered information sentences. Okay. If we illustrated this a little bit, here's another paragraph that kind of shows you another way to do this. In a later paper, this is a paragraph after the previous one, Glick and Fisk went on to determine, so that's information, the extent to which 15,000 men and women across endorsed both hostile and benevolently sexist statements. There's my second information sentence. First of all, they found a hostile benevolent sexism. And then here's my analysis. This is analysis from the author. She uses their information, and she uses a pronoun to indicate that it's their information. And then here, this is her. This is the writer of the essay. So it is not the case that people who endorse hostile sexism don't tend to endorse benevolent sexism, whereas those who endorse benevolent sexism look nothing like the real sexists. Again, this is her thinking. This is her writing, her ideas. So it doesn't need documentation. Okay. And then down here, these are also information sentences. And we know that this is part of the source because it refers back to this paper. Okay. When do you get to insert your own ideas? Well, you control the introduction to your paper. You control what the topic of your paper is going to be. You control the topic sentences of your paragraphs. You control the overall organization, and you write the conclusion. All of that is your own, okay? All the analysis sentences are yours. So the commentary before and after the source material, that's up to you. And again, why are you doing that? Well, you're trying to make sense of it. You explain why it's there. Um, you try to use it to connect this analysis sentences. You use them to connect information as you move from one point to another in your paper. This is why you don't need to use first person. If there's no documentation and it's clear from the verb that you've chosen that this is your own thinking, that's all you need. And again, if you look at the sexism essay, you're going to see that she's inserted herself frequently in there without having to say, I think this, or I think that, or here's what I believe, or it's my opinion that. Try to avoid using that in your paper. The only time you should use first person is when you're describing your own experience. I was a victim of sexism when this happened to me. Then it would be appropriate. But when you're providing analysis of a topic within a paragraph, or even of its own paragraph, you could probably get by without first person. This is not easy. I don't expect this to be something that you're going to execute right off the bat, but it's something that I hope you will try. Beginnings and endings. How do you begin and end a concept paper like this? Start with a story. If you look at the cannibalism paper, the student writer there begins with a very long story about a particular group of cannibals. Okay. One of my rules is that no more than 20% of your paper should be a story. Maybe 1 page out of 5 should be a story. And that includes what reference you make to it at the end. Right after you tell a story, you then should introduce your controlling idea, your main point, what exactly your paper is going to be about. And there should be like a short transition as depicted in this story or as exemplified by this narrative or something like that, that indicates that the story is connected to the rest of your paper. Okay. Some things to avoid in the beginning. Some people like to begin with a quotation from the source. I think that's hard because you got to pick just the right quotation. But I would avoid generic quotations. I would avoid dictionary definitions. I would avoid famous sayings by people, or I'd avoid cliches, all that kind of stuff. And if you are going to include a quotation, include it from the source, or include it if you think you need it to make a particular point about how important or how big a deal something is. Okay. This is not easy, and that's why I usually suggest that students don't bother. Remember, too, that your title can be a good place to help you with your beginning. It's the second thing people see after they see your name. If you look at the cannibalism paper, the title's real simple, Cannibalism. It still exists. Well, what's important about that is the fact that we don't think about cannibalism very often, but the first part of the title gives us a topic. The second part says, hey, this is why it's important. There still are cannibals. They're not just cartoon dudes like we see maybe in a magazine or online. They're real. And so that's the first indication that that's why the student wrote this essay is in the title. So remember that that title is an important piece of space. It can go a long way to helping you out. The endings. Endings in a paper are always tough. There's 3 classic ways to end. There's what we call the frame. If you start with a story, end with a little bit of a story. Bring us up to date. Tell us where people are now. The second common way is the expander. And we see this in some of the essays that we've read, that we look at the larger significance of it. Maybe we're looking at cannibalism, but what we're really looking at is the complexities of human behavior. Okay. And then the summary is probably the least useful for papers in this course, but might be important in English 102, or if you decide to write a master's thesis at some point in your life or a doctoral dissertation. That's when an ending can kind of summarize the main points that you've made and present sort of a little mini package of your entire essay to its audience. Okay. Another way you can do this, the fourth way, is to leave audience with a telling example. Soup and Sexism both do that. They both end with an odd example that kind of goes back to the beginning, but it also establishes the importance, the significance, the complexity, or the uniqueness of the topic being discussed. The last thing to point out is never introduce a new topic in the last paragraph. Many students make that mistake because they say, oh, I forgot about this till now. And when I see that, that usually tells me that what I'm reading is draft number 2. I'm not reading draft number 5. And you should always write more than 2 or 3 drafts. Professional writers, as I mentioned before, say they write 11 as a rule, and I think that's a good number to work with. The last thing I want to do is talk about the Works Cited page. The other 2 videos that I've made about documentation discuss this, but just remember that these are the straightforward rules that we follow. It's the last page. It's in the same font, the same format, double space, Times New Roman, no bold type as the rest of the paper. You list your sources alphabetically by author, or you list them by the title if you don't have an author. Remember that different source types have different formats, and that web sources can be tricky. I would use the examples in the textbook, the stuff in Easy Writer, use the Writing Center handouts, and use Noodle Tools. Go back and watch that video again on Noodle Tools if you haven't had a chance to see it.